You've been told that Roman legions conquered the known world through discipline and superior tactics, but the truth is, Roman soldiers barely built half the empire, and the forces that actually did the heavy lifting have been erased from every history textbook you've ever read. Right now, when you picture Roman military might, you see organized legionaries in red cloaks marching in perfect formation, but that image represents less than 30% of the actual fighting force that carved out 3 million square miles of territory across 3 continents. The Roman military system was built on a foundation of auxiliary troops, foreign mercenaries, allied kingdoms, and conscripted local forces who provided the manpower, specialized skills, and regional knowledge that made conquest possible, yet they receive almost no credit in popular history. For every Roman citizen legionary wearing that iconic segmented armor, there were 2 or 3 non-citizen auxiliaries doing equally dangerous work for a fraction of the pay and recognition. These weren't support staff or laborers, they were frontline combat troops, cavalry units, archers, slingers, and specialized forces that Roman citizens simply couldn't or wouldn't provide. Here's where it gets disturbing. Roman citizenship was restricted and exclusive, which meant the pool of potential legionaries was artificially limited by law. At the height of the empire, Rome had roughly 60 million inhabitants, but only a fraction held full citizenship with the right to serve in legions. The rest were provincials, allies, or subjects who could only serve in auxiliary cohorts. These auxiliary units made up more than half of Rome's total military strength by the 2nd century AD, providing approximately 250,000 troops compared to 150,000 citizen legionaries. They fought in every major campaign, held defensive positions along thousands of miles of frontier, and absorbed casualty rates that often exceeded legion losses. But when you read about Roman victories at Alasia, Masada, or along Hadrian's Wall, the narrative focuses almost exclusively on legion commanders and citizen soldiers, while auxiliaries become invisible footnotes. The Batavian cohorts, Germanic cavalry, Syrian archers, and Numidian light infantry who actually secured these victories disappear from the historical record except in specialized academic texts that most people never encounter. This is the part historians rarely mention. Rome didn't have enough citizens willing to serve 25-year military terms to garrison an empire stretching from Scotland to the Sahara. The solution was auxiliary recruitment from conquered peoples, essentially forcing subjugated populations to provide troops for further conquests. A young man from Gaul or Thrace would be recruited into auxiliary service, sent to the opposite end of the empire to prevent local rebellion, and used as expendable shock troops in dangerous campaigns. If he survived 25 years of service, he'd receive Roman citizenship and a land-grant citizenship that his children would inherit, creating a deliberate system of cultural assimilation through military service. This wasn't benevolent opportunity, it was calculated imperial policy designed to turn conquered peoples into stakeholders in the Roman system while extracting their military labor at minimal cost. Auxiliaries received roughly 1/3 the pay of legionaries, inferior equipment, and none of the prestige, yet they performed the same combat roles with the added burden of being stationed far from their homelands in hostile climates and unfamiliar terrain. But the real shock came when archaeologists started analyzing military diplomas, garrison rosters, and tombstone inscriptions across the former empire. The evidence shows that entire campaigns relied almost exclusively on auxiliary forces with minimal legion involvement. The conquest of Britain used Batavian and Tungrian cohorts for the initial amphibious assault because they had specialized river crossing skills that Italian legionaries lacked. The eastern frontier against Parthia depended on Syrian and Arab mounted archers who understood desert warfare and could match Parthian cavalry tactics. The Danubian frontier was held primarily by Dacian, Pannonian, and Thracian auxiliaries who knew the terrain and tribal politics of the region. Roman generals didn't win through citizen-soldier superiority. They won by recruiting the best fighters from each conquered region and deploying them strategically across the empire. The famous testudo formation and gladius techniques that we associate with Roman military dominance were often performed by non-Romans who'd been trained in these methods and integrated into the imperial war machine. This changes everything we thought we knew about Roman identity and empire building. The legions provided a professional core, an ideological symbol of Roman power, but the actual work of conquest, occupation, and frontier defense fell disproportionately on auxiliaries who had no voice in Roman politics, no representation in the Senate, and limited legal protections. They could be executed for mutiny, but they couldn't vote. They defended Roman territory, but couldn't own property in Italy. They made Rome's expansion possible, yet Roman writers like Tacitus and Livy focused their accounts on citizen commanders and legionary heroics while treating auxiliaries as nameless masses. Even modern popular culture perpetuates this erasure. Every Roman military film from Gladiator to HBO's Rome centers on legionaries while auxiliary characters barely exist. We've inherited a narrative written by Roman aristocrats for Roman audiences that fundamentally misrepresents who actually built and defended the empire. The evidence gets even more uncomfortable. Rome routinely used allied kingdoms and client states as military proxies, essentially outsourcing entire campaigns to non-Roman forces. King Herod provided troops for Roman eastern campaigns. The Nabatean kingdom supplied cavalry and camels for desert operations. Germanic tribes allied with Rome fought other Germanic tribes on Rome's behalf, with Roman generals taking credit for victories achieved primarily by these federated forces. After the crisis of the 3rd century, this system became even more pronounced as Rome increasingly relied on foederati barbarian tribes given land and autonomy in exchange for military service. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the Roman military was so thoroughly composed of non-Roman peoples that generals like Stilicho were themselves of barbarian origin, commanding armies where Roman citizens were a minority. The Western Empire's collapse wasn't an invasion by foreign barbarians, it was a dissolution of the payment and political arrangements that had convinced barbarian troops to keep fighting under Roman command. Here's what actually happened. Rome built its empire through a sophisticated system of military assimilation that incorporated the martial traditions, tactical specialties, and manpower of every conquered people. The legions provided standardized training, logistical infrastructure, and a unifying command structure, but they never fought alone and couldn't have conquered even a fraction of their territory without auxiliary support. Those auxiliary forces weren't assistants or helpers. The word auxiliary itself is misleading modern translation. The Latin term auxilia meant allied troops, forces that augmented Roman power but were absolutely essential to its function. Without Gallic cavalry, Germanic infantry, Spanish slingers, Cretan archers, and North African light troops, Roman legions would have been outmaneuvered, outranged, and overwhelmed by enemies who specialized in exactly the forms of warfare that Roman heavy infantry couldn't effectively counter. Rome's genius wasn't military superiority, it was military synthesis. The ability to adopt effective techniques from enemies, recruit defeated warriors into Roman service, and deploy combined arms tactics using troops from across the known world. The definitive truth isn't that Roman soldiers were incompetent or that legions didn't matter. It's that the Roman Empire was a multicultural military enterprise from its earliest conquests, and the narrative of Roman citizen soldiers building civilization through disciplined valor is nationalist mythology created by Roman writers and perpetuated by modern scholars who rely too heavily on literary sources written by and for the Roman elite. The archaeological and epigraphic evidence tells a completely different story of diversity, exploitation, and assimilation. Every major Roman military achievement involved auxiliary contributions that had been systematically minimized or erased. Hadrian's Wall was built primarily by auxiliary cohorts. The Rhine and Danube frontiers were garrisoned mostly by non-citizen troops. The conquest of Dacia, the suppression of the Jewish revolts, the campaigns in Mesopotamia, all relied on auxiliary majorities doing the fighting and dying while Roman commanders claimed the glory. So, when you imagine the Roman military machine, don't picture rows of identical legionaries. Picture a complex coalition of dozens of ethnic groups, speaking different languages, worshipping different gods, united only by Roman command structure and the promise that service might lead to citizenship for their children. That's the real story of how Rome built an empire. So, what myth should we break down next?